Welcome to the Power of Your Voice podcast with your host, Johnny Gorky. You have the power to overcome challenges and fears. Let my voice and the voice of many others show you how to transform these challenges into opportunities. To learn more about future podcasts and read episode show notes, check out my website at www.thepowerofyourvoice.com.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Power of Your Voice podcast. This is episode 35. Today's guest is Roderic Yapp from the United Kingdom. He is an experienced speaker, facilitator, and accredited coach who specializes in experience in developing people in sectors where leadership failure usually results in death or critical injury. A former Royal Marines officer, Yapp was fortunate enough to lead Marines in operations around the world. The highlights of his career include leading 30 Royal Marines into combat on the front lines in Afghanistan and evacuations of civilians from Libya during the Arab Spring. You may recall back on October 10th in 2011, the Italian ship called the MV Montecristo. It was captured by pirates. Roderic led the recapture of this 55,000-ton ship from pirates in September of 2011. As part of a Nato counter-piracy task force off the Somali coast. In 2012, Roderic joined Urenco, an international supplier of enriched uranium for the nuclear fuel cycle. Roderic was responsible for delivering the Operations Excellence program as part of Urenco's journey to world-class enrichment. He coached leaders across the organization, developing specialist experience in areas where leadership simply could not afford to fail. In 2005, he founded Leadership Forces, which focuses on developing leaders within organizations. His clients include HSBC, Deloitte, Jaguar, Land Rover, Royce, and Nato. Roderic, welcome to the Power of Your Voice podcast, sir. And I just want to say thank you for your service.
No worries. No, not at all. I was lucky enough to get paid to do the job. So yeah, I got a pretty good deal out of it as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing as a child and what you learned growing up about leadership?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So I grew up in the UK. My father was in the Foreign Office, so every few years we disappear overseas for sort of a 3 or 4 year stint. Holland, New Zealand, sort of a few different places before I started secondary school in the UK, so high school. What did I learn about sort of leadership growing up? I suppose in many respects, I probably learned some things not to do, if that makes sense. So my father was married a few times, and there are some sort of areas around kind of his behaviour or ways in which he interacted with people that weren't necessarily that sort of healthy, sort of relatively short temper, sort of those kind of things. This isn't sort of meant to be a judgment or anything like that. I guess I sort of realised the impact that people can have on other people through their behaviour, and that sort of kind of got me thinking about the whole sort of concept of leadership. It led me to a career, it led me to university, led me to sort of follow what I was interested in at university, which mainly revolved around sort of water polo and sort of playing team sports, and then ultimately into a career in the military. But I think the kind of biggest thing I learned was that although learning from a difficult example or one that's not necessarily terribly positive can be quite painful, you get a huge amount out of it, because I think the most painful lessons we learn are often the most valuable ones, because they drive us not to repeat the behavior.
Oh, I completely agree. Yeah, a lot of times we go through certain situations in life and you're like, why am I going through this? But those are the big breakthroughs, and you learn so much about yourself going through those experiences. Going into your childhood and the experiences in your youth, what mentally prepared you for the Royal Marines?
I think a number of things. When I was 13, my family moved back from overseas, quite a sort of critical age for a lot of young people growing up. And in the space of about 12 months, my parents' marriage disintegrated, for want of a better description. I was in a new school, new culture, new environment that, to be honest, I didn't really understand. So, didn't have a huge number of friends. And my grandfather, who I definitely looked up to, who'd served in the military for the majority of his career, he died, and all that happened in about the space of kind of 12 months, a lot of it whilst I was at boarding school. And I think that was when I look back at it, that was a very, very difficult time for me. But I think it gave me a sort of sense of mental strength that if I could kind of get through that and do reasonably well at school, then if I really sort of set my mind to anything, I could accomplish it. But it really was about sort of setting my mind to it and kind of using those challenging and difficult experiences and reframing them and making the best out of them.
So like, what's something that might have happened to you when you were a kid that mentally prepared you? So when you were in the Royal Marines, like, thank God I went through that experience, because had I not have gone through that experience, I wouldn't really be prepared for this experience that I'm currently going through.
Well, I think, I actually saw my grandfather die. I was there with him. And I think, that memory really sort of drilled into me this whole point that, none of us know how much time we've got left. And he lived to a pretty ripe old age. He was sort of in his late 70s, 80s when he died. So it was a combination of that, not really knowing how much time we had left, coupled with the desire to sort of do something with my life and be part of something that was bigger than myself. Whilst my father didn't serve in the military, both of my grandfathers did. They both served in the Second World War. And so I always sort of felt that they were part of something that was bigger than they were. And as I was sort of growing up from sort of, those critical ages from sort of 13 to 18, I used to read the newspapers. I'd often turn to the obituary column rather sort of randomly. And you'd sort of see all of these people who were featured in the obituary column who'd served in the Second World War and then who'd gone on to achieve great things in the military. And if there was a sort of a blueprint for my life, it started to formulate around that point in time. I guess this sort of realization that, life is finite. None of us know how much of it we have left, the desire to serve, but also this, probably those two things are the kind of key things. I guess that's probably it.
Yeah, and doing something that's much bigger than ourselves. Yes, that is definitely very important.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, because there's so much more to life than just going to work, working a 9 to 5, coming home, watching TV, doing the same thing over and over again. There's so much more to life. Now, the experiences that you've been through the Royal Marines, what did those experiences teach you about leadership?
So I'll give you just a brief overview of sort of my 7-year career, and then I'll sort of talk a little bit more about the kind of the lessons I learned. So very, very briefly, I joined in 2005. I went through 15 months of commando officer training. I served in Afghanistan in 2007, leading Marines on the front line. I was lucky enough to get sent out to Libya in 2011 to get civilians out when the Gaddafi regime collapsed. And then towards the end of my career, I specialized in counter-piracy and served a couple of tours off the coast of Somalia, arresting and interdicting pirates who were trying to get into the shipping lanes. And I think the first thing I learned about leadership in the Marines is this whole concept of leadership is done by example. It is up to you, the example you set, as to whether it is a good one or a bad one. It's not quite as binary as that, but ultimately it's all about your behavior. And that was drummed into us right from the start. And the Royal Marines are a pretty impressive organization, and they sort of drum this point home by getting the officers to complete their commando tests in faster times than the Marines have to. So that very first moment when you stand up in front of a group of 30 Royal Marines in sort of preparation to lead them to become a troop commander, the system, the way it's been created, the way you've been sort of set up is all sort of set up for success around this concept of leadership by example. And so that was probably the first major lesson that I learned about leadership, that it is done by example.
You led the recapture of a 55,000-ton MV I don't know how to pronounce that. I don't know exactly.
Montecristo, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what that is, but that definitely requires leadership skills. So if you led that, what did you learn about yourself and leadership and what you were capable of doing?
So that's It's a really interesting mission. So that was a 55,000 ton container ship. It was off the coast of Somalia, had pirates on board. We had to effectively get on board, get to the crew, release them, and arrest the pirates. That was basically what the mission involved. The thing that I'd learned about, I think the kind of key lesson I learned about leadership, and certainly in that area, was that we had planned that kind of recapture or that sort of hostage release situation over and over again. And I think that by the time that we'd actually sort of come to execute it, sort of come to go through it, the guys knew exactly what it was that they were expected to do. So one of the kind of key lessons I took away from it was this whole planning process, this kind of process of rehearsals, of thinking about, right, what are the things that can go wrong? How are we mitigating against those? So that when you actually play something out in real life, the multiple different scenarios that you get faced with, people know what they're expected to do. And I think that that's directly applicable to the civilian world. And if you think about how most people sort of plan things, there's a small group, normally a planning team put together, generally sort of senior leaders within an organization. They put together a plan and then they go and execute it. And generally speaking, they are more optimistic than they should be that the plan will work, because the plan is put together in a sort of very static environment and it's delivered in a very volatile environment. And this is kind of one of the things I sort of learned, is that, yeah, you may have a view in which a plan will go, but the reality is when you execute it, it's like a series of almost sort of tributaries, different ways in which things can happen, in which ways things can go wrong, in which the enemy can do something to sort of trip you up. And this whole process of exploring those different things that can happen was something that I have taken from that moment and certainly applied that in the civilian world and the corporate world, which I'm working in now.
Yeah, because that's the thing. In the corporate world, you probably have little time to organize and rethink things, but you're literally going on this big ship. There's people being held hostage. There's guys in there with guns, and you really don't know what exactly could happen. But your mindset is no matter what happens, we're going to go in there and we are going to be very successful at it. So like, how do you really set yourself up for success? Because regardless of what is going to happen, you know you're going to be successful. It's like, there's no way you're going to lose.
So your confidence comes, a lot of it, from your training, because through the training that you do in sort of basic training and officer training, the training you do with your guys, you do it sort of over and over and over again, and you're sort of pushing your limits, pushing your boundaries. And that's kind of where your confidence comes from. It's not arrogant. There is a sort of difference between the two. It's an ability to sort of understand what you're able to do. And because you have rehearsed it, because you've been trained, because you've developed your competence in some very challenging environments, that to me always sort of gave me the confidence that we'd achieve what we set out to do. And unfortunately enough, we did.
And that's great. And everybody got out, I hope.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the challenging thing with a hostage release or a hostage rescue, is that the bar for success is pretty high. Everyone has to survive. And fortunately for us, that was the case. The pirates, to be honest, they didn't try and fight us terribly hard, if you know what I mean. They were pretty quick to lay down their weapons when sort of 30 Royal Marines are scrambling on board the ship to arrest them. They didn't put up much of a fight.
Well, they were smart because they know they would lose. And if you win with your life, you won.
Absolutely.
Why do you think most organizations, they fail their leaders? Because they're not always doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I mean, it took me a little bit of time to sort of work this out. But if you think about the way organizations grow, it typically starts off as a small team, and then gradually, that team gets bigger, and then it gets to a sort of critical point where you need to put some management layers in, you need to put a bit of structure in. And most of the time, and this is true of all organizations, they promote people because they're good at doing stuff. They're good at getting things done. They're generally sort of good performers within the organization. And because you promote them into a leadership position because they're good at doing things, what you do is unintentionally reinforce this behavior. So you promote someone into a leadership position because they're a good salesman. What you're actually doing is reinforcing their ability to sell. And actually that that's one of the things that I think organizations get wrong, because leadership is not actually about really doing stuff. It's about the management of the team. And I think what organizations do is they promote people who are good at things. They expect them to be able to manage a team kind of innately. And the reality is that when people are under stress and pressure, they generally tend to go back to doing more stuff. And the way it was explained to me is that the role of the leader is not so much to do more things, it's more to conduct the orchestra. So you're promoted because you're good at playing the instrument, but then the job is totally different. The job is to conduct the orchestra. And that, I think, is a really common thing I see in organizations, and people are just sort of left to get on with it. It's one of the reasons I think that many people have disagreements and relationship, breakdowns with their leadership and their bosses. It's because fundamentally they don't get taught how to do this very well, and they do their best. I generally think that most people come to the workplace trying to get things right, but by and large, the organization does not set them up well, because it promotes them for often the wrong reasons, but then it doesn't support them to take those first steps. And if you think about where leadership development is generally devoted to, often it's at the very top of an organization. And my challenge with that is that not always, but often, if you've got to the top of an organization, if you've got to a sort of very senior level, I would hope that you've worked out certainly a few things by then. And actually the real need is for people often at the very sort of junior level. If I think about myself and my sort of leadership journey, I was really lucky. I had 15 months of leadership development and training before anyone put me in charge of anyone or anything. What do most people get? It might be a few days on an offsite. It might be an online course if they're lucky, and they're just sort of left to kind of get on with it. And I see that, and I see that as a major problem for organizations. And I think the problem the problem looks like issues in relation to poor performance, lack of difficult conversations, problems with the culture, behavioral issues, morale and motivation problems. All of these are, generally speaking, down to a lack of leadership, fundamentally.
Yeah, well, I've definitely seen this in my experience. Sometimes they'll promote somebody and, okay, we're going to spend this much time on training this person. But then the managers, the people above them, everybody's so busy, they don't have time to train anybody. And then people never get properly trained.
Yeah.
And you can't really train somebody on a computer. That just, the mindset and personality and culture, you're just not going to get that from rereading documents.
No. And I don't think leadership is something that can be learned online like that, purely through reading things. I think that it's one of those skills that you pick up by experience. Yeah, look, don't get me wrong, models, stories about other people who've led teams, all of this stuff is really, really useful. But I am very, very skeptical of the approach that some organizations have, which is, this is how we lead, read this book and do that. Because in almost every circumstance, when someone says, right, this is how you lead a group of people, there is a context or an environment where where it won't work. So often, people will say to me that, leadership is all about empowering people. You want to push decision-making right down into the organization. You want to empower people to make decisions. And I'll say, look, 99% out of 100, I absolutely agree with that. I think that is absolutely the way to create your culture and sort of encourage people to lead, by pushing decision-making down to the lowest level in the organization and decentralizing this control. However, if you and me were to walk out of the office right now, we saw someone get hit by a car, would you want me to turn around to you and go, how would it feel to call an ambulance now? Yeah, do you think we should call the police? Is that the right thing to do? And what that exposes is the fact that behavior is very, very contextual, all right? And that's an example of where empowerment doesn't work in that environment. Now, I grant you that's an unusual circumstance, but it is a circumstance that people are faced with. And it's one of the reasons that in the military, we do hold the right to sort of go back to this kind of very tight control, this very sort of tight, hierarchical, controlled environment, because often we're faced with circumstances where that is entirely appropriate and applicable, but it's not always the case. And I think, when I've really I spent, I guess, the last 4 or 5 years thinking about this, or trying to articulate my thoughts. Leadership is all about understanding two things. You've got to understand the context that you're faced with, the situation, the challenge, whatever it looks like, the people. Are you taking over a team where, frankly, their last boss thrashed them and they've got a morale problem? Or are you taking over a team where the performance hasn't been right? Or are you taking over a team that has recently suffered some form of scandal? Because each of those are slightly different contexts that you may face as a leader, and you need to adjust the way in which you behave to get the best out of the situation, the best out of those people. So I think leadership is understanding the context you're faced with, understanding yourself, your own behavior, your natural desire for things like control, and understanding where do I need to be on that spectrum. So whilst a lot of people would say, yeah, you absolutely want to empower people, again, most of the time that's right. However, if you take over a very junior team where frankly people don't know what to do, or they don't have the experience on which to base their decisions, that's not an environment where you want to necessarily empower people. That might feel quite scary to some of those relatively junior people. Sometimes you might just want to set them clear instructions and be very direct about your expectations. So you start off on this sort of tightly controlling. You start off on the sort of, tighter control end of the spectrum. And then gradually, as they start to pick things up, you can start to empower them. And you can start to say, what do you think I'd like you to do now? What do you think we should do now? What do you think, what is it we're trying to achieve here? You can start to use a sort of more intent-based approach. But that's really, that's one of the ways in which I've really sort of changed my thinking about what leadership is over the course of the last few years.
That goes into this next question, because this is very important. How can organizations create a culture where feedback is actively sought and received? Because, you have people put in certain situations and there's no feedback. That can be a big problem.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about feedback is that you don't know if you're doing a good job, especially in a leadership position, unless you're generating that feedback, right? Because here's an interesting paradox. You don't get to decide whether you're a good leader or not. Your people do. But you don't know that unless you are asking them, am I setting you up for success? Am I getting the best out of you? What are the behaviors that I demonstrate that you would challenge? If we flip this relationship around, how would you develop me? It sort of encourages people to sort of see themselves from a kind of different perspective. And it can often be a little bit of a challenging one. And when I think about and again, this is sort of a common problem that I've seen within organizations. And when I really sort of start to think about it and go, well, hang on a sec, why do people not like feedback? Why is this a difficult conversation for people to have? Why are people resistant when someone says, even if I was to say to you, just look, can I give you a bit of feedback about something? There's that natural sort of, that almost wincing, that sort of slight anxiety that gets generated when someone says something like that to you. And I think the primary reason or where it sort of comes from is that if you think about, as you're a child growing up, right, there's the classic sort of story of, the picture you draw at nursery school that goes up on the fridge, okay? The child comes home, it's done something really good at school, it's a brilliant picture, that's great, really, lots of praise from the parents, it goes up on the fridge, right? And whilst our parents might say that their love is unconditional, and I've got no doubt about that for sort of most people, whilst they might say their love is unconditional, their praise, their admiration is entirely conditional. And this is often how, as parents, we develop the right type of behaviors within our children, okay? And we do it through conditional praise. Now, this goes all the way through your life. So, you go to school, you get a good report card, dad pats you on the head, well done, son, good effort, really pleased with that, all the way up sort of secondary school, university, early stages of your career, you do good work, your boss encourages you, they're happy with that, maybe there's a bonus that gets tied to it, and this performance is consistently sort of reinforced through praise. Now, in order to get to a very good standard at something, that model works really, really well. The trouble is that especially in subjects like leadership or if anything, if you want to go from being good at it to being genuinely world class, you need to be able to divorce your personality away from your performance. And you see, if you think about, going back to the sort of child with the picture on a fridge example, what you learn from all of those kind of, all that sort of praise working all the way up to your career is that in order to do good work, in order to do something to a high standard, you need to invest everything about yourself in it. So chances are you figured at one stage that you needed to, in order to do good work, you needed to invest everything about yourself in it. The trouble with that is that as soon as you start to invest everything about you in your work, it becomes very difficult to receive feedback without taking it as a slight on your personality. And so when I'm working with leaders, I'm working with organizations, what I'll encourage them to do is divorce the two concepts apart. And the way I do that, and I'll use myself as an example. So, Johnny, this is me delivering a performance, right? This is me doing my job. This is kind of part of my business. Now, when we stop recording and we hang up, you may turn to me and go, that was rubbish. You barely answered any of the questions. That will be boring. Obviously, I'll be massively devastated to hear that. But that is feedback on my performance, all right? As soon as I hang up the phone, I go and see my children. I go and see my wife. They will hopefully say hi to me and greet me at the end of a sort of long day's work. And the reason for that is because they see me for my personality. And I think that when you're seeking feedback from other people and when you're seeking to give feedback to people, split these two concepts in half and say to them, look, we need to have a difficult conversation about your performance. But look, at the end of the day, I like you. You're a good guy. We get on well, we go for a drink, happy with that. You are a good person. But my job as a leader is to improve your performance. That's what I'm here to do. And I have to challenge you. In order to get the very best out of you, I have to be really clear about ways in which you can get better. So this is a conversation about your performance, all right? And the things that you can do to improve and the areas you need to work on in order to get better. And I think that if leaders start to do that, and if they start to invite that kind of feedback, as painful as it might be from the people that work for them, they start to have a significant impact on the culture of the organization. Because ultimately, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about the way the leaders behave. Because really, culture is just a reflection of the leadership behaviors that are exhibited within the organization, fundamentally.
Yeah, because feedback is so important. I actually recruit people for construction jobs. And some of the people I talk to, they leave companies because they don't even give any feedback. And at the end of the day, I believe everybody wants to become a better person. We want to be a better leader, better father, mother, whatever it might be. But some people don't give feedback, or people, they just take feedback personally. I joined Toastmasters several months ago. I'm not sure if you guys have Toastmasters over there in the UK, but it's amazing.
I'm familiar with it, yeah.
You guys do?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And one of the great things they do is, you're doing public speaking, you're standing up in front of a bunch of people, but they construct feedback. So this feedback, these are things that were great. These are the things that you get to work on. And these are things that, by you knowing things that you can work on, well, that allows you to become a better person. But my experience has been with some managers, they take feedback, any feedback you give them, everything, they take it so personal. And I think as a community, we have to learn to appreciate feedback, want to get feedback, because that's the only way we're really going to be able to grow as individuals.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you can see, as soon as someone, you can almost see from their facial expressions, when you start to say, look, can I have a feedback? Can I have a conversation with you about your performance, or can I give you some feedback? Those facial expressions, they indicate that the person doesn't want to have the conversation. They either don't want to hear it or they don't want to give it, and it's really, really difficult, but it's incredibly valuable. It's a side of yourself. It's a perspective. It's a view that you absolutely need, I think, to improve your performance.
Yeah, and it has to be detailed. You can't just say you did a good job or you need to work on this. That doesn't really help anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that leaders need to be good at observing, switching on to all of the things that are going on within their teams, within their people, the way in which people interact, so that they can give that very carefully measured feedback of, I saw you do this. This was the impact of that behavior. Okay, can you see how that might be damaging, or that might not be great in the long term? that's a great conversation. It's really sort of clear, based on sort of facts and data. It's not that kind of sort of vague, I think you need to improve in this area. And I think, leaders can set themselves up for success by spending time, not just reflecting on their own performance, but, over the course of a week, right? How did my people behave? How did they perform? If you're forced to start thinking about these things, then it makes it much easier to have these sort of performance conversations with people, because you've been alive to sort of what's going on, rather than just sort of sitting down for the annual appraisal and just trying to think, right, what did this person do this year? Because that, again, doesn't work particularly well.
How do we fix this? Like, for example, sometimes a person might get a performance review. It was like 0. These are things that are just, you're not doing well at all. Then you have a 10 where you're doing perfect, but they literally just circle a number. So it's like, okay, you're doing an 8 on communicating with staff, or you're doing a 7 with being quick at responding to people's emails or whatever. That's not really good feedback at all. And talking to some managers, they might say, well, we can't really give a lot of feedback because, people might take it the wrong way. I'm like, how do you fix that? Because feedback is so incredibly important, but people don't provide feedback because they're scared that people are going to retaliate or they're going to take it personal. How do you fix that problem?
Well, so I think setting the conversation up for success is critical. You got to explain to people, look, part of my job is to help you improve your performance. I'm not doing it unless I can find ways in which you're going to get better. So, working with me for the next couple of years, however long it might be, my expectation is that you will be exponentially better in 2 years' time. Okay, that's kind of a key part of the sort of leader's job. I think being really, really clear in terms of, first, the expectations of the relationship. Secondly, when you're going to have those conversations, share that point. This is performance. This is personality. And I think personally, if the leaders go first, if they say, look, I would like you to give me some feedback on my performance. What am I doing well? What could I improve? And if they get into the habit of doing that regularly, and it becomes a two-way conversation rather than a one-way conversation where the leader just shares points for improvement from the individual, it starts to make it more and more comfortable. And a bit like, I've heard this expression used before, an inoculation is a little bit of something bad that sort of, sets you up for success in the long term. I think that if leaders can get into the habit of having these feedback conversations, I would argue on a relatively short weekly basis, rather than this once a year painful annual appraisal process, that's much, much more preferable. Because actually what you want to create is, rather than one feedback loop once a year that frankly a lot of people don't really pay too much attention to, you want to encourage sort of these regular feedback loops. Once a week, 15 minutes is all it has to take. It really doesn't need to be much longer than that, much more difficult, much more process than that. You sit down with a group of your team, say, right, give me some feedback. What have I done well this week? Let's just look at the past 5 days. What did I do well? What could I have done better? Where were some of the things that I did, or what did I do that had a negative impact on your performance? What had a positive impact on your performance? You give that back to me as your boss, and then I'll give you some feedback. But after a few weeks, those will just become normal conversations. You won't even feel them as slightly awkward or different because you're having them so frequently. And if you think about those conversations, let's say you do them on a weekly basis, that's 50 a year. That's 50 feedbacks, 52. That's 52 feedback loops that you're getting, as opposed to one once a year. And so I would encourage organizations to be careful with the volume of process that they put in, and just, ensure that it's just happening. Okay. Just regular feedback conversations. Are they going on? And don't necessarily give people that sort of structure. Like, for example, rate your communication style on a scale of like 1 to 10. Well, how do we know? It's kind of an odd thing to sort of get someone to rate themselves against, or vice versa. And what you generally tend to find is everyone defers to about a 7 out of 10 anyway. So I would argue that that's not terribly useful. And I think that's what you want to be thinking about, is like, well, what's the process that we're going to put in here? And is it going to be useful? Is it going to be useful to our culture? Is it going to be useful to our people? Is it going to give them direction? Because ultimately, you should be expecting people to get better as they work in your organization under your leaders.
I really like that. Yeah, because if people are just doing it once a year, that's just not enough. It stresses people out. Having someone, okay, here's your performance. I want you to rate yourself. Then I'm going to rate you, and we're going to kind of compare that. That doesn't really do anything. But constantly having a culture where people feel that, okay, I can give you feedback, you can give me feedback, and this is a win-win situation for everybody. The managers can grow, the people below the manager can grow, everybody can really feel comfortable being able to talk to anybody about anything. And there's really no miscommunication because they feel like they're in a very supportive environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, leaders need to, so we've all had those moments, right, where a company has let us down through its service or whatever. If you call the complaints line or whatever it is, and you just start screaming at them, right, and lose your temper and tear into them. That person on the other end of the phone, are they invested in helping you?
No.
Of course they're not. Of course they're not. So you've got to think about what's the outcome you want. I mean, I've recently had an instance where I had to sort of, call an organization and sort of make a complaint about a service that they weren't doing. And I said to the person on the end of the phone, I said, look, I'm frustrated, but I appreciate this is not your fault. Okay, this is not your fault. And you don't need to apologize to me. You personally haven't done anything wrong, but this is my feedback on the issue, and this is the impact it has on me. Okay, so anything you can do to help me out, or compensate me for any of these issues or these problems, I'd be very, very grateful for. But ultimately, this is kind of where we are, and this is why I'm dissatisfied, and this is why I'm on the phone. Now I know damn well that's going to make a huge difference as to whether I get an outcome that I want and that's good for me, that other individual, and the organization. That's far more likely to have the chance of being successful, than if I just pick up the phone and start caring to some poor person that has to deal with those complaints all day long.
Oh, exactly. I mean, that person is going to want to help you.
Absolutely.
That's good. What is one question you were never asked that you wish you were asked?
Oh, wow.
Sometimes people do interviews, and after interview, like, I wish that person would have asked me this question, but they didn't. So what is something you've always wished somebody really would have asked you, but they just never did?
It's an interesting question. I have to sort of think about things that I'm particularly proud of, or things that I've sort of spent a lot of time thinking about, or things that I consider I've kind of done quite well. I guess, the one question that I think really sets people apart is what's your process for self-development? And I've used this in organizations to support them in hiring kind of better candidates, because my view is that whatever it is you're doing, and it really doesn't matter what it is, you should be trying to do it to the very best standard that you can. So I often ask people, what is your process for improvement? So if you're a sales guy, well, how do you get better at sales? Right? Well, what is it that you are actively doing in your spare time to help you get better at selling? Because I'm interested in not so much what it is they're doing, but more that they're actually doing something. So I'll ask them questions like, tell me about the last book that you read that changed your perspective on sales, or that taught you something that you didn't know that you have directly applied into your working life. Okay? Because I'm really curious to understand what someone's intrinsic motivation and what someone's intrinsic motivators are, and how they are actively looking at getting better at their job. Because so often people will say things like, well, I'm just sort of gathering experience, and like, nothing wrong with that. But that to me is kind of reactive. How are they looking at themselves about the things that they understand, the things that they don't understand, and sort of trying to widen that circle of competence? How are they trying to get better at what they have decided their specialization is? And I think experience is a really interesting thing, because you'll often find people who will say, well, I've got 20 years of experience at doing this job. And I would challenge it with, well, how long does it take to get competent at what it is you're doing? 2 years? Okay. Well, then I would argue that's 10 lots of 2 years worth of experience rather than 20 years of experience. And it's interesting because if you look at sort of high performing industries, if you look at flights, aviation, if you look at the medical profession, if you look at the military, often what they'll do is they'll encourage people to move jobs every 2 to 3 years so they don't become stagnant. Because you should be learning, you should be growing, you should be developing, you should be taking your previous experience and applying it to a new role and a new environment. And I'm really interested in sort of what people do to improve themselves in whatever domain. I really don't care what it is. If they tell me that they love chess and that they, spend their evenings studying, I'm really struggling to think of a chess example, studying the moves of Garry Kasparov or whatever, fine. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. I'm curious to understand what it is that they're doing to get better at whatever they decide is their chosen craft or their art or what they want to spend their life doing.
Yeah, that's good because a lot of people, they just do the same thing over and over and over and over again for 20, 30,
absolutely.
40 years, and they don't really branch out because you've been doing something for 20 years, but how do you know if you do something else you might be better at it, you might like it more? Use that experience towards something else to continue to grow.
Absolutely. And I think that that's what we should be doing. We should all be doing that. We should all be thinking about ways in which we can grow and develop. If the last sort of 10, 15 years has sort of taught us anything, it's the fact that, a job for life doesn't exist anymore. There's no such thing as that. So you're constantly going to have to find yourself learning, improving, getting better. That's the way of the world now. I think that's the way it's going.
Some of the people I talk to who've been doing something for 10, 15, 20 years, it's like people feel stuck. It's very hard, even with what I'm doing. I might be talking to somebody who's been working at the same company for 20 years. They don't like the pay. They don't like the vacation. They don't like their retirement package. They don't like all that stuff. But even though you could put them into a different position where they might be happier, where they might get paid more, they might have more room to grow and to really embrace all this experience and maybe work with younger people where they can use their leadership skills to help them grow as individuals, which is really a big, big thing, to be able to teach other people all the great things that you learned over your entire career. But some of the people just don't want to do it because they're so scared. Well, what happens if I don't like the people? Or what happens if I don't like the culture? I mean, there's so many things because it gets so used to working at some place for so long. They're just scared of the unknown. How do you really get someone to really break out of that and take a chance on doing something new?
Well, again, I think it comes back to what do you want your life to look like? Where do you want to be in 50 years, 60 years, however old you are and however time you think you've got left? Because the reality is none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. We're all pulling a sort of ticker tape out of that kind of machine that you see often in the butchers, all those places, and we've got no idea the reality how many we've got left. So I would say, well, if you are dissatisfied with where you are, okay, think about what it would look like if you spent the rest of your life being dissatisfied with that. Okay, what are the sort of stories you're going to tell your grandchildren? What do you want to impart to them when you get to that kind of age? Hopefully it will be, something in relation to the fact that, look, life is finite and it's kind of worth living and it's too short to be unhappy for huge amounts of time. So I always try and get people to sort of think about the end. If they feel that they're stuck in some sort of, funk, or they're unhappy with some of the sort of decisions that they've made, think about, right, where do you want to be at the end? Where do you want to get to? What's your sort of final career, or where do you sort of want to get to? Do you want to be CEO of the organization, or it doesn't really matter, but where is it you want to get to at the end, ideally, and then sort of start to think about working backwards from there. So if they're unhappy with their current job, okay, so what makes them happy? Think about what are the things that they enjoy doing and start to look for a change in career, or start to look to do something that appeals to what they like doing. I think a huge amount of this comes down to the ability to sort of understand yourself and sort of know what it is you want. everything becomes much clearer if you know what it is you like doing, if you've got a sense for what you're good at, and if you know where it is you're trying to get to. And I think so few people spend time really sort of thinking about that stuff. And they end up getting stuck in things that frankly make them unhappy, and they sort of waste a lot of time in that position. You know, life is way too short for that. If you're unhappy with your career, change it. If you're unhappy with anything in your life, do something about it, okay? But the only thing you can guarantee is that if you don't do something about it, you'll be stuck in the same position in 12 months' time. And the internet, I think, is a wonderful resource for lots of things, everything from interesting cat videos to all kinds of information. But fundamentally, you can find out so much more than you ever could before. So the excuse that you don't know what you want to do doesn't wash with me. Go out and find out what it is you want to do. Go and speak to people who are in an area that you think might interest you, and then have a conversation and say, look, this is what I like doing. You know, these are the things that I'm good at. Would that make me be successful in your industry? The answer might be yes. Brilliant. Okay, that's a door I want to keep open. I want to continue to explore that. The answer might be no. Okay, and that's fine too. At least you close down an option, and by closing a door, you're a little bit clearer on where it is you want to go in the future. And I think those are the things, or that's the kind of stuff that people sort of want to think about in order to break themselves out of this sort of funk of being stuck and disappointed with what they've got.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I mean, there's really no excuse. I mean, look at this right here. I mean, like, you're over there in the UK, I'm here in the United States. It's like the possibilities are completely endless. You can learn, you can reach out to anybody, because with the technology that we have available, there's really, really no excuse for anything. If there's anything you want to learn, you can go on YouTube, you can learn about anything, literally.
Yeah, absolutely. Mate, I mean, 2 weeks ago, I took a radiator off the wall, and I did it all by following some instructions on YouTube. Now, I would have no idea how to do that, but you could find a way, right? And so, whenever people say, I don't particularly like reading, or reading puts me to sleep, fine, listen to podcasts. Commit yourself to watching one video on how to do something differently that relates to your role or something that you want to do. Commit to one video a week. That's not a lot of time. That might be 20 minutes, okay? That's 52 videos a year. That's over 100 in 2 years. Okay, that's a hell of a lot of learning. Okay, it's just a question of applying a little bit every single day or every week or whatever makes sense to you. Benjamin Franklin had this concept called the 5-hour rule, and I find it over and over again, which basically relates to, if you spend 1 hour a day getting better or improving yourself, that has a compound interest effect over time, which will see you outperform your competition or your peers. And it's really interesting because when I sort of scratch beneath the surface to understand more about inspiring leaders, people that are achieving huge things, you look at someone like Elon Musk or Warren Buffett. I'm just using some American examples that spring to mind. And you find out things about them. Often they've read an enormous number of books growing up. The recent U.S. Defense Secretary, General Mattis, he is reputed to have something like in the region of 5,000 books. Now that's incredible, but there's no accident. There is no accident that he got to the position where he was. That is done because he's effectively spent time developing himself, learning and improving. And I think it's a really simple question, right? Everyone knows the answer to this, because if you sort of really want to kind of drive this home, ask yourself this question: Would you want to seek advice or guidance from a mentor that has read 10,000 books, or someone that has watched 10,000 hours of reality TV? Okay, who's going to give you better guidance? And then what do you spend your time doing? And I think it just kind of really brings it home. It could be 10,000 hours of reality TV or computer games. And again, none of that. I'm not seeking to judge anyone for how they spend their time, but just if you want to get better at things, it takes discipline and application. You got to do it every day, or you got to say that once a week I'm going to do that. because after a while, the compound interest starts to take over, and that has an exponential impact on your performance.
The big thing is everything, it adds up. Just like you were saying, like we have a little puppy, and I walk, I don't know what that is in meters, but I walk about 5 miles a day. And over the month, it's been over like almost 100 miles. Now, at first, it doesn't seem like much, but when I add up every single minute that I've walked that dog, I've walked over 24 hours. Now, no one's going to walk probably for 24 hours at a time, but when you think about adding it all up, it adds up to a lot. It really, really does. Now, I was watching your TED Talk, and you talk about double loop learning. So how does that apply in leadership and changing behavior?
So double loop learning is all about going back and looking at your underlying assumptions for how you approached a problem. So, feedback loops revolve around the concept of sort of, planning something, doing it, and sort of picking up on sort of what worked, what didn't work. Most people have a tendency to sort of single loop learn in that they continue to apply these same methods of thinking, which has set them up for success in areas where it doesn't need them to be successful. And I can explain this easier with an example. Most people are taught to work hard, right? You got tons of people online, Gary V, all kinds of people saying, you need to work really, really hard in order to be successful. And I would argue that's absolutely true, okay? And there is a narrative whereby entrepreneurs work really, really hard in order to achieve success. However, it doesn't matter how hard you work if you are working on solving a problem that no one is willing to pay for. That's kind of irrelevant, but people do that all the time. That's not the sort of foundation for kind of a successful business. That is an example of single loop learning. If you were to work really, really hard at something and it fails, and you don't really go through that process of sort of looking at what were the ways in which I thought about things that led this to be unsuccessful. So maybe my ability to plan isn't that good. Maybe I've got an optimism bias. So you come across these people that sort of have this kind of, mental model where they believe that, things will be okay in the end. And actually, especially with a business, it often tends to be very binary. It's not. So understanding yourself, understanding that, I have a natural optimism bias, and how that plays out in your behavior, that's an example of double loop learning. It's about looking at the way in which you naturally approach things and where that has set you up for success in the past, and sometimes it does, but equally the limitations of it. I would argue that lots and lots of people in the military or with military experience tend to be very, very good at managing risk. And often that's because intuitively they've been taught how to do that. They've been taught to think about all the things that are likely to go wrong, all the things that can go wrong, what's the most likely course of action, what's the most dangerous course of action, and therefore what do they need to do? So lots of people will maybe sort of talk to me about my business and sort of, I'm not particularly numerate, but I do know exactly how much I spend a month, and I do know how much I need to earn. And therefore I know that the delta between the two needs to stay positive. Otherwise things aren't going to go so well. And whilst that's not the only thing I'm thinking about, that's an example of how in the back of my mind, I'm managing the risk all the time. Does that make sense? Hopefully I've explained that clearly.
Like, for example, you might have somebody, they work really hard. They do everything themselves. Now, you're looking at what you do, and what you do is you always do everything on yourself, and you work hard, and you don't really spend any time with your family because all you do is work. And when you look at it, you might, okay, well, how can I change this? Maybe let me focus on sales, or let me focus on one particular thing, but let me get somebody to help support me, and let me hire somebody so I can focus on what I do well, and let somebody else do something I don't do really well, but let them focus on that.
Exactly that.
Okay.
Exactly that. It is. It's exactly that. But people often don't have the self-awareness to know what they're not good at. they sort of think generally we have a sort of bias that suggests that we're good at lots of things. So the ability to kind of relinquish control and sort of delegate and bring other people in with a sort of, you know, different skill set who aren't like us. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. But it revolves around, I mean, double loop learning revolves around this ability to be really introspective and think about your behavior and think about yourself, think about the role models, think about the ways in which you've been successful and where that might trip you up in the future. Those sort of mental models, those kind of automatic ways of thinking, starting to spot patterns where you've made mistakes and sort of where you've got things wrong. That's kind of what it revolves around.
So you really need to really assess yourself very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think leaders, you know, one of the kind of the foundation of strong leadership is developing a strong sense of self-awareness. It really is understanding, you know, what you're good at, you know, where you're on your best, where perhaps you're not on your best, and what are the kind of, you know, warning signals that would indicate that you are perhaps not behaving as you would like to, or not performing to your best ability, or not setting the example that you would be most proud of looking back on.
What do you think is more challenging, leading at home, leading at work?
So I could go either way on this, depending on what day of the week it is. But generally speaking, I think that it's harder to lead in the working environment. And the reason being is because hopefully you've got a sort of solid marriage and, you know, things at home are sort of stable and everything like that. And I think if you do, you've got a really sort of strong connection with someone and a really deep relationship with them, whereby, you know, they've got your back and they're sort of, you know, they're there to kind of help you, and your marriage is built around sort of serving other people. You know, I know not everyone's is like that, but you know, if it is, then, you know, being at home can make things a heck of a lot easier. I think often in the workplace it's harder to lead because often it's more difficult to sort of get to know people. And if you don't have that sort of depth of relationship, if the relationship is kind of sort of transactional, you know, if you don't really know that person, it can make it much, much harder to lead them. So where possible, one of the things I sort of encourage people to do is kind of get to know their team, you know, not just about sort of, you know, the kind of minor details, you know, where they last worked, but really get to understand them. You know, where did they grow up? Who inspired them as they were growing up? Where did they go to university or college, if that's relevant? You know, do they have children? How old are they? What are their names? What's the name of their spouse? Where do they go on the weekends? What do they spend their disposable income on? All of these kind of things will give you an indication of how that person thinks and how they behave. Also, what is it they want out of a career in your organization? Do they want to stay for a few years, or do they want to become the next CEO? Now, the answer doesn't matter. It's more about how you use that information to support that individual get to where they want to go. Because if someone, say, particularly in your team is particularly interested in marketing, any opportunities to interact or go and work with marketing to get a sense of what that's like is going to be helpful to that individual. You know, you're putting their needs above potentially your own or that of the teams. And again, this is a balance. It's not an easy thing to get right. But, you know, leadership is about, to some extent, is about sort of a feeling, you know, how people feel about you. And if your team feel that they have, that you have their best interests at heart, they are much more likely to give you that discretionary effort. They're more likely to go the extra mile on your behalf when you need them to. And again, that's what makes it so tricky.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love what you just said, because honestly, out of all the places I've worked, I've only had one manager. So one guy, he's like, hey, come to my office. I want to talk to you. I'm like, okay, great. I'm like, I didn't do anything, did I? He's like, no. I want to get to know you. I'm like, what? Get to know me? I was like, I've never had a manager ever say that. And he's like, yeah, well, you know, I believe it's very important to get to know the people I'm around, because, I mean, when you think about it, you spend more time with your coworkers than you do with your kids, with your spouse. You spend, you know, most people 5 times a week from 8 to 4 or whatever long, but at least 40 hours a week. You spend a lot of time with your coworkers. And he just wanted to get to like what kind of music you like. Do you have kids? How old are they? What are their hobbies?
Mm-hmm.
what are your what's like your next goal for working here for the next month? What is your goal for the next 6 months? What's like your goal for the next 5 years? What do you plan on doing? Because regardless if you stay for the next 5 years, I mean, that's up to you. I just want to make sure that I can help you and support you so you can gain as much knowledge, you can become the better person. I'm like, wow, that is amazing. But when people actually care about their staff and they really want to get to know them, it builds a great rapport, great respect, and it makes you want to work more and harder for that person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, it's difficult to measure that feeling, but you know when it's there and you know when it's not there. And, I should imagine that chances are that you felt that person you work for had your best interests at heart. And actually, because they took the time to find out about you, they cared, right? That's really all we want to know is that, do people care about us? Do we matter? And I mean, that was something that I learned at a really, really, really young age in my sort of career in the Marines. This whole concept of know your men. You have to know your people, because if you don't, then they'll assume that you don't care about them. And whilst that might not be true, if that's their perception, there's the reality. So you have to get to know them. Otherwise, they won't trust you.
That's very true.
Fundamentally, the military revolves around trust. So
it's so true. I think the problem is there's like this mixed conception that if you're a manager and you get to know your people, it's like you're trying to be their friend, or it's just not professional, and that's why some people don't do that.
Yeah, and I think there is a fine line with this. You have to be friendly, but sort of not necessarily friends. So, I would consider friends the sort of people that you go out sort of drinking with and sort of stay out kind of all night, go to clubs with and stuff like that. I mean, when you're a bit younger, obviously. I think you need to be able to maintain a level of professional distance so that you can have those conversations with people where you challenge them and you support them. If you are buddies with them, if you're best mates with them, it doesn't give you that space to be able to support that individual and challenge them and help them improve at whatever it is they do.
Yeah, so you just have to have, I guess, a good balance.
Yeah, and that's really difficult. And I think, with, again, everything we've talked about here is about judgment and balance. That's why I'm peculiarly skeptical of someone that says, this is how you lead people. This is how you do it. I'm like, well, what's that based on? Oh, it's based on my experience. I've led teams. I'm like, well, I've led teams too, right? But the thing is, right, I'm very aware that I have led, young, highly motivated, very fit, 20-something-year-old men. That gives me a vehicle for leadership, but that doesn't mean I can lead every team. I have to be aware of the sort of shortfalls in my experience and be clear that, yes, they are helpful. But if I'm leading a team of sort of, demotivated accountants, what worked in the Marines doesn't necessarily work for that team.
Exactly.
So again, it's about understanding this context.
Now, from your leadership standpoint, you've worked with some of the largest brands. What are some of the greatest things that you've noticed that they have all had in common?
It very much depends on the sort of so it depends on the teams within the organization, I would argue. So these large organizations, very big companies, large banks and so on and so forth, the culture or what works really well is often very dependent on the particular leader that is running the team at that point. And I think that the common thing that I've noticed is that when the team have this sense that the leaders are not in it for themselves, when they believe that the leaders are there to serve them and support them, things tend to go pretty well, okay? When it's flipped around and, when successes get the team gets congratulated for something, for example, and the leader takes all the credit for the performance of the other people, that tends to kind of undermine things. And vice versa, when bad things happen, mistakes get made, and people then flip that round and sort of pass that all onto their people and say, it's their fault, nothing to do with me. That sort of sets the tone. When those sort of behaviors are reversed, when leaders, for example, when mistakes get made, they're like, well, that's up to me. That's my failure to communicate an expectation, or it's my failure to manage a risk or something like that. But the buck stops with me because I'm the boss. But when successes come through, when the team does something really well, and they look to sort of pass that on to the people and say, look, that had very little to do with me. That was the success of these guys here who work for me. I'm really lucky. I've got a really awesome team. You know, when leaders do that, the team tends to want to work for that individual. You know, they tend to like being there. They tend to be willing to put in that discretionary effort. And I've seen it in, I would say, sub-teams. There's very few organizations that I've seen where I've gone throughout the organization and seen it across the board. Because ultimately, you know, the culture is created by the shadow of the leader. And hopefully, and in the better performing organizations, you tend to have a greater balance of high-performing leaders towards the top of the organization, but in various levels throughout it, rather than an unhealthy balance, or in the worst-case scenario, some form of toxic leadership culture, which does happen.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love, I should say, about Gary Vee, because that's one thing he stresses a lot. It's like, hey, if I'm making a mistake and things are not doing well, he'll take full responsibility for what can I do as this company to fix things, to work with things. And when the team is very successful, he doesn't take, okay, well, this is all because of me. He makes sure that the people he's working with, they know they had the big role, and obviously he's doing something right. So what he says is so very true. You know,
and it's inspiring as well, isn't it? It's inspiring. It's why we like listening to him. It's why he's popular. Yeah,
because I remember an interview he was doing. He posted on Instagram, and the guy was complaining about something, and Gary was like, "You suck. You're a horrible leader." And the guy's like, "Ooh," but he's like, "No, what are you doing that's not working?" And it made the guy realize, "Wow, okay, I need to ask myself better questions. I need to be a better leader. I need to take responsibility for the people. It's not the people's fault. It's my fault as a leader. I need to communicate with people better," which was just very amazing and very humbling. A lot of people don't want to take that responsibility to blame themselves for something.
Yeah, and I think that's true in leadership, and I think it's true in parenting as well. You know, there's similar roles in different contexts, and it's difficult. It's really, really hard. But that doesn't absolve you of the responsibility you have for shaping and influencing the behavior of someone else.
Yeah. If you would go back in time, say when you're about 18 years old, what are like 3 pieces of advice that you would give your younger self through all these experiences you've been through in life?
I would say, so it took me a while to figure out this kind of, this sort of self-learning philosophy, you know, the self-development philosophy that I've picked up. So if I could go back to my 18-year-old self, I'd tell him to start reading, read more, you know, start digesting more high quality content. Think carefully about how you spend your time, because we've only got a finite amount of it left. So think carefully about that. So that would probably be the kind of first thing, you know, start developing this sort of compound interest effect in relation to learning. Think about how you spend your time and choose to spend it wisely. That would kind of be the first thing. The second thing would probably be something in relation to, 18. Set your standards high, both your expectations of yourself and really sort of set those standards and set that vision, you know, 10% higher than you think you can achieve, because that will sort of force you to kind of think differently about where it is you're going. And I think pretty soon after I was 18, you know, I started to sort of think about the military and I started to sort of get on that track. And I think I was quite lucky in that respect to find that kind of thing. And lastly, I guess the kind of final point is, you know, if you're struggling to make yourself happy for any reason, if you're having a particularly bad day or you're going through a tough time, focus on making someone else happy. Because I found that, you know, if you try and sort of give yourself to someone else, if you try and think about sort of serving other people, if you're having a crappy day, think about, okay, so how can I make my wife's day a little bit easier, or how can I do something to help out my children? Because ultimately, that's going to come back and make you feel just a little bit better, but also it's going to be a better use of your time than sitting there in a bit of a funk, in a bit of a state about something that hasn't worked out for you. So those are probably the 3 things. But that's a difficult question.
I really, really like that. That's good. Make other people happy. When you're I'm just not having a good day, focus on making someone else happy. Smile, say good morning, whatever it might be, and you never know what that might do for you. And of course, you're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it to help other people. But that is big. And especially speaking of having a big vision, I remember listening to a podcast, this guy, like, imagine if you just had a goal to make, say, $1 million, you might make it. This guy, his goal, he's like, my goal is to become a billionaire. Now, even if I don't become a billionaire and I say I make $800 million, he's like, that's not bad. That's definitely not bad. That's really, really good. But if you set really small goals, then they're very easy to accomplish. But you have to set really, really big goals that you're probably never going to be able to achieve. But at least you always have something to keep on reaching towards. Because he said most people, they don't really set big enough goals. That's a problem for people. So that's a good
And
one.
I think that's true. And, I came across a brilliant question by Peter Thiel of I think it was PayPal fame. He will ask people, where do you want to be in 10 years time? What do you want to achieve in 10 years time? And they'll set out a vision because they know that question is coming. And then he'll say something like, right, why can't you achieve that in 6 months? Now, I love that question because it forces you to think exponentially.
Yeah.
So you're suddenly left with, right, what would be all the things that I wouldn't do? Now, it may force you to come out with some incredibly difficult decisions, but the point is not so much whether you'd achieve it in 6 months. Even if you achieved it in a year, you've achieved it in a 10% of the expected time frame. It's those questions that force you to think totally differently. I think they're really, really valuable. So yeah.
Now, for someone who's listening, and especially the thing I like is, you have your own business, and being in the military, sometimes people in the military, after they get out, I have some friends in the military, they don't know what to do. Like after, one of my good friends, he's been in the military for probably 18 years. And then I think he's going to work at the post office or something. Very smart guy. But some people, when they get out of the military, they don't know what to do because they're so used to that way of living where everything is very structured and everything. And then in this world, this civilization, it's just much different. Now, for someone who's listening who might be in the military and they want to start their own business, what's some advice that you would give them?
So before they even think about taking that step to start up their own business, my advice would be to go and get a job and kind of work out what the civilian world looks like. Because I think, and this is purely based on my experience, therefore it should, as all these things, should be treated with a little bit of caution. But I think if you leave the military and then go straight into the into setting up your own business, often it's really difficult to understand the problems and the challenges that people face. So I think the first thing to do is work out what it is you like doing in the military and go into a career, into an organization or a company or something that allows you to do that. And spend a bit of time taking a bit of the pressure off yourself, sleeping in a bed in the evening, seeing your children, and just do good work for another organization. Don't go out and start something straight away. That will give you a sense of what it's actually like to be in the corporate world. It will civilianize you. And then if you have aspirations to start up a business, I would start focusing your self-development and your learning on how to do that well. Because there's an enormous amount of things that you can do on the side whilst you've got the security of full-time employment before you take that huge step to go and build something. Because those early years of setting up a business are the riskiest. They are the ones where it's really, really hard, where people don't kind of get you. It's one of the reasons, obviously, most businesses fail inside the first 3 years, is because those early years are so difficult. So use the way you thought about management of risk in the military and think about ways in which you can mitigate that risk whilst bringing in a paycheck, whilst paying the mortgage, and think about how to do that. And then be really, really clear on what is the problem you solve and for who. Because if you can't clearly articulate that, you'll waste a lot of time trying to find those people. And ideally, what you want to be able to do is find them quickly so that you can service their needs and you can build a business off the back of that. That would be my very early stage guidance for someone thinking about doing that.
That's good. And that'll save people a lot of stress and time and all that. Thank you. Roderic, how can people find you online on social media if someone's like, hey, I love this guy. I want to work with them, maybe do coaching or maybe hire you to work for their corporation. How can people get in touch with you?
So one of the good things about having an unusual name is that it's easy to find me online. So my name, obviously, Roderic Yapp. If you tap me up on LinkedIn, I'm happy to sort of connect with pretty much anyone. So hit me up there. My website is leadershipforces.com. I write a blog, I would say, every sort of few weeks on something that on some thoughts around leadership. And I do sort of everything from kind of, leadership development programs, workshops, all the way through to coaching. And then from time to time, I get asked to come in and do a speech about, the leadership principles from, sport or the military or the business world, or all three. But LinkedIn is probably the place to find me.
All right, great. And yes, you are the CEO of Leadership Forces. So your expertise is working with different organizations and how they can develop their leaders?
Absolutely that, yeah. CEO feels like a very grand title. It really is me in a very small team, but yeah, that's exactly where you can find me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Roderic, for being on the Power of Your Voice podcast, man. I greatly appreciate your time, sir.
No worries. I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Johnny.
You're welcome. Johnny here. Thank you for listening to the Power of Your Voice podcast. I'd love to get your feedback on this episode and how it impacted you. If someone in your life could benefit from this episode, share it with them. Check out thepowerofyourvoice.com to read show notes, leave a comment on the blog page, and to stay updated on all future episodes, subscribe to this podcast and leave a 5-star review. Thank you for your love and support.